And we're back with Truth Unrestricted, the podcast that would have a better name if they weren't all taken. I'm Spencer, your host. Today, we're going to have a meta conversation. That is, a conversation about a conversation. I've noticed that in some situations, the rhetoric surrounding the concept of transgenderism is starkly negative, and in other situations, there simply is no rhetoric at all. Most people avoid this topic with vigor. I suspect that there are a lot of people who don't have anything against transgender people, but also don't understand how to have those conversations. We've come to learn that there are inherent pitfalls here that we don't understand. So then I ask the question, would those conversations happen if we understood the pitfalls and could talk about this without being rude? The world isn't the same place it was when I was growing up. It has a different shape. I now have a choice. I can reject that new shape and petulantly demand that the world revert back to its previous state, or I can accept that the world doesn't conform to my wishes and instead work to understand the environment I'm in now. That's what today's meta conversation is about. It's an attempt to increase the overall understanding of this phenomenon so as to improve everyone's conversations about it. With that, our special guest.
Yeah, hi, I'm Grace Leeder. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I podcast for post-show recaps, and Rob has a podcast about scripted TV and reality TV and all sorts of things. And I also work as a in healthcare education for Diabetes Canada. So yeah, that's me.
So, um, how do I how do we do this, Grace?
A great question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you introduced yourself with your pronouns.
Yes.
Should I have done that? Was that rude of me to not? I'm
No, I don't think it's rude of you to not. I think that you certainly can. And I think that I do it because I would prefer people to call me by those pronouns. The idea that they're preferred pronouns also is a bit of outdated language. Those are just my pronouns, but I think I do it because, I've never done any like, voice training, anything like that. It's become a practice in which people do it. I think it certainly shows some level of inclusivity to do it yourself. But yeah, I think even for trans people, I think it's like it's a little bit awkward to do it. It's part of the introductory thing that not a lot of people do, and I don't always do it. So yeah, so
right.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think pronouns are sort of the I don't know tip of the spear, I guess, because that seems to be what a lot of people focus on first whenever this sort of gets broached. And in some ways I get that, in some ways I don't, because for people my age and maybe like a little younger than me and everything older than that, there's sort of a generational gap there. We lived in a world where there it's not that this phenomenon didn't occur, but especially for people who weren't living in cities, I relate it to something like some people say it's like a unicorn, but I don't like to say that because unicorns don't exist and transgender people
right.
do. But it's more like an astronaut
Mm-hmm.
because as a kid, both transgender people and astronauts, I understood that they existed
Mm-hmm.
because I saw them on movies. But I legitimately felt when I was 10 years old that it's unlikely that I'll ever meet either.
Right.
And so I built my world in my mind such that, yeah, they're there somewhere in the world, but I don't have to worry about them because I'm unlikely to ever be in a situation where I have to deal with that. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I mean, I think too, like, yeah, you would see, and also like the idea that calling them trans was not the language that was used for a
No,
while
not then.
too.
Yeah.
And also, there are more trans people who are out. I will not, I don't know the numbers of how many
Yeah.
people have been trans, but trans people have been around for forever.
Yeah.
But It's just that it's safer. You know, the classic example is showing the study about the number of people who are left-handed, number of people who
Mm,
identified in left-handed. There's a sudden surge once kind of became more acceptable to be
yeah.
left-handed, and then it plateaued, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's kind of what's happening right now with trans people, is that it's safer than ever, although not entirely safe for everybody, to come out as trans. And so yeah, more people around you might come out. Yeah, depending on where you
Yeah.
live, you might have never encountered them. I grew up in a small town. I remember one time there was a trans person when I was, who I saw come into a restaurant and was like, oh, that person's like trans. Maybe that's
Hmm.
not the exact language I used at the time. And that's like the only person, until I started to explore my own gender identity, that I met
Right.
other trans people. So yeah, same. It's just like you don't, and we're still like, I think only about 1% of the worldwide population identify as
Yeah.
trans, a very small amount
Yeah.
of people.
It's
Yeah.
probably a little less than 1%, but
Yeah.
still it's just,
Oh,
it,
fewer than 1%.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
the stat I'm looking at. Yeah.
In that point, it's very hard to tell the numbers because this has been sort of a unrecognized thing for so long that,
Yeah.
and the same thing with homosexuality and a lot of other uh, ways in which a person could live and exist that wasn't recognized. They had to make a choice. Like I
Yeah.
I described, I have to make a choice. They had to make a choice where they had to hide a thing about themselves, and that's very psychologically damaging, I think.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so people choose not to come out for their own safety. And I talk a lot about media, and I think the reason I like talking about media is because I think it's a bit reflective of our world, and not always, sometimes that's a distorted reflection
Hmm.
of our world. That for a long time, the people who controlled what could get made, portrayed, literally laws to say that, if a queer story is on television or in a movie, it can't have a happy ending. So I think, yeah, and so I think media is so interesting from that lens, to say it's where people might encounter trans people, and if you're the way that you're viewing somebody is only through this stereotyped or stigmatized lens,
Hmm.
then you
Yeah,
that's the notion you move through the world. Why would you think any differently?
right.
Yeah.
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 Media is a funhouse mirror for
Uh-huh.
society, really.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I
So,
know some
yeah.
trans people too, Spencer, who actually don't love the idea of sharing their pronouns, and obviously this is
Yeah.
anecdotal, but the idea being, if you're in a room and there's one trans person
Hmm.
and everybody goes around the room, and I think the idea that it's so difficult is because for a very long time, sex and gender have been perceived to be the exact same, and where the idea of telling people your pronouns is that you might have a gender identity, your gender identity might match what people would presume your pronouns to be. So this is where it came up.
Hmm.
And it's very funny in one-on-one conversations. Like in this conversation, Spencer, you're never going to use my pronouns probably, right? You're going to say
No,
you
I'm going to
or
refer
my
to
name.
you. Yeah.
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 So it's never going to come up in this conversation. And
Would
so
be
in these,
talking about you in the second person near you.
yeah,
That would be
which
so awkward.
it
Yeah.
feels very rude. Yeah, I
Yeah.
have to say.
Tell someone
So
else about you
yeah.
that isn't in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. So I don't do it in like every meeting I'm in, or, at work, or whatever, on every podcast I'm on. I do it often when I'm like, I'm meeting potentially like a client at work, and I want them to know that, like, okay, if they're going to be sending emails that might be about me, I might want them to understand what my pronouns are. But some
Mm,
people don't like it because in a room full of cis people and there's one trans person,
mm.
you feel like you're singled out in a way, because it's like, you're not sure what that pronouns are, and then like, you're the person who this is all for, in a
Yeah.
sense, that it
Right.
feels like this thing.
You
And
have
so yeah, so within the
you get
community,
that
I think
special
there's
treatment line that sometimes is
yeah,
trotted out. Oh, you want to be treated
yeah,
special, right? Yeah. And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
also terrible.
yeah.
Let's
So
just call that what it is.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
some people who are trans, I think, actually like would prefer, but it typically, I think, happens to people who their gender identity would match typical like cisgender identity. So if you would pass, for example, or
Right.
we get really complicated, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
This
yeah,
is,
yeah,
yeah. Looking into this, it does get very complicated.
yeah,
So about pronouns, I
yeah.
mean, we've been told all manner of thing about pronouns in the last 10 years or so, probably more like 6 or 7 years or so. Are there any new pronouns? Is this a real thing, or is this just a thing people talk about?
I mean, there are, whether or not they're new, I think some of them certainly are new. I will be honest. Again, the trans community is so small, and then
Hmm.
there are, these ways. A lot of people balk at they them and being like, it's not grammatically correct. It's completely grammatically correct
Sure.
to refer to a singular person using a they them pronoun. And I think that in some way, I don't know, there's a Canadian, I don't know if I want to call him philosopher person. I don't even really want to name him, but his objection to pronouns was that it was limiting his freedom of speech. That to
Yeah.
use pronouns that people requested actually is an invasion of freedom of speech, which we don't actually really have in Canada, but alas. That and I this idea that it's like uncomfortable. My brother talked a little bit about, like, I had a friend who's using they them pronouns. It's like it's unusual for your brain to work. You're 30 years
Yeah.
old and you've thought about the way you speak in this way, and suddenly you're
Yeah.
you're doing something new. It's the same thing as a lot of the language in terms of trying not to, people asking, try not to use the word crazy or lame.
Yeah.
It's so ingrained in your vocabulary that it takes a long
Yeah.
time.
Once you think like that, you speak like that.
You
That's
speak like
how it
that.
is. Yeah.
So it takes active training, and I often think, like, the thing that happens is that the thing you learn is as you try it, as you mess up,
Mm,
hopefully in your brain triggers, oh, I did it wrong. And the
right.
next time, hopefully it happens sooner and sooner until the point where it happens before you speak, basically.
Right.
But there are these new pronouns. They're very rare. I don't think I've ever met a single trans person who has uh actively used anything other than she, her, he, him, or they, them. But there are these other ones. And I think the thing that people get concerned about is that there's people have obviously used they of, like,
Yeah.
where did they go? Oh, they went to the store. And you're talking
Yeah.
about your dad or whatever. But these other ones that are like z, zer, and they're so uncommon to us that they feel these sort of neo pronouns, I think that they're called. I don't entirely know what to make of them. They're very rare. They're very uncommon. But some people do use them, and I think that, I imagine that person will have their own. If you're close enough with someone that they would request you use those pronouns, I would advocate that you try to use them as much as possible. But
Yeah.
it's very,
Well,
yeah, yeah,
right. But at no point do we have to, there's not going to be a booklet that comes out, gets delivered to everyone in Canada with a whole list of the however many number that are claimed. I think the number that's claimed is probably exaggerated for effect and
yeah,
based on people that are attempting to push back at this idea for a reason I haven't yet understood. But uh, yeah, I mean, this is mostly about just being polite,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, and it's the idea that in Canada we might, you know, have a weirdness about that doesn't surprise me as a Canadian.
yeah. I
We've
know.
always
Yeah,
been weird about what to exactly do to be polite. That's
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the thing for me is that, this professor who talks about it's a limitation of freedom of speech. Like, he's certainly right to say that you can use whatever pronoun you want for somebody,
Hmm.
so long as, for me, the most important distinction about when someone misgenders me is, are you actively trying to be mean, or
Yeah.
are you did it by accident?
Yeah, right.
And most of the time I don't even know, and it won't impact my my life that much, right? Like, unless, if somebody, so people can call literally people can call me whatever they want, as long
Hmm.
as it doesn't border on, harassment. But, this idea that you must always get, and that the police are going to come and lock you up. Are you
Yeah.
a Parks and Rec fan? Do you know the Fred Armisen thing of, like, in his country you go to jail for everything? Like, this is not the future of, like, what's going to happen with respecting people's pronouns, or disrespecting people's pronouns. And if you use the wrong pronoun, honestly, I'm probably not even going to correct you most of the time. And the piece of that is, I always feel like, to an extent, being trans can sometimes feel like I'm being inconvenient to people. And I know that I'm very privileged in the sense that I feel like I don't actually get a lot of, like, I don't get misgendered a ton. I don't, whatever. But so, for example, I was at a dinner the other night, and it was a dinner for a colleague who had left our organization, and there was a person I knew but not really knew very well, and I don't
Hmm.
I don't think I pass very well as, like, as feminine. And so during dinner, whenever he would refer to, he would say he. But I was not gonna like stop dinner to be like, sir, just so just so you know, I
Yeah.
felt like I was gonna disrupt dinner, and like I could do it for my own, but it doesn't really bother me that much because he was actually, the way he was behaving towards me did not feel antagonistic. So
Yeah.
I don't really care. Some people might care more, in which case I would advocate that like maybe I wish some of the people there who knew me would have corrected him a little bit.
Mhm.
Maybe that's the place I feel like allies can, create these safer spaces. But honestly, at the end of the day, it was fine because he was engaging with me in a way that was like he was interested in what I was talking about. He was sometimes
Yeah.
when he was saying is like, oh yeah, he does a podcast and he has all these like he was like he was not
Yeah.
doing it to be antagonistic. So nobody's coming and arresting him or fining him or anything for using the wrong pronouns. I think that if you do it, if you purposely know somebody's pronouns and then you start using the wrong pronouns, I would mostly say like, what does that get you?
Yeah.
What, and I know we could then theorize about what bullies get out of being bullies and what people get from
Yeah.
spouting hate, but honestly
People
it's
try
just
to
like,
walk the line in that way.
yeah,
It's like holding your finger very, very close to someone's eye
yeah,
and then declaring that
yeah,
you're not touching
yeah,
them.
that's right,
It's very
yeah,
childish, and
yeah.
yeah.
And I think what they think they're doing is speaking truth. But if all the people at the table, say I'm at this table, and one person is purposely antagonistically using the wrong pronouns for me, and everybody else is using the right, well, who's actually speaking truth in the situation? Probably everybody else at the
Oh,
table who
yeah.
is fine with me identifying the way I identify, and one person
Yeah.
who thinks for some reason science has proven in the history that there can't be trans people and they don't actually exist, and I'm making a mockery. Like that's not true. Trans people exist. There's a really interesting Neil deGrasse Tyson talks with does an interview with Ben Shapiro. If you ever seen it, you can probably pull up the clip, and they talk about and Ben goes, but science is science. He's speaking to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's one of the foremost
Yeah. Science
scientific people,
communicators,
and
yeah.
he goes, but if it's true that there are people in the world who believe that their sex is different than the one they were born with, then isn't that scientifically true? Isn't that also scientifically true? And what do we do to, if all the science then shows through scientific evidence
Mhm.
that letting them use the pronouns, calling them by the name, letting them dress how they would identify, and being perceived in that manner, that helps them contribute more to society rather than not be part of society, isn't that scientifically true as well? Isn't that evidence to
Yeah.
prove that yes, they
Yeah.
exist, and so it's a really interesting conversation they have where, yeah, anyway.
Trans people exist when we recognize that they exist, and that's, yeah. I mean, this gets to a question that I have here, is that what do we mean when we say that gender is a social construct? We could probably have a whole extra episode about this if we wanted, but I mean, in my life,
Mm-hmm.
in my lifetime, when I'm looking back at analytically at what I've considered to be this male female thing and everything else, most of the aspects here are appearance, right? And the lines between these things have blurred quite a bit in that time, right? When I was a kid, it was considered odd, like accepted, but some protest from older people when a boy, like a teenage boy, got an earring.
Right. Right.
It was done,
Mm-hmm.
but it was, you got from the older generation this thing. Oh, boys don't wear earrings, girls do.
Right.
That's pretty arbitrary, right? And now it's just common. No one bats an eyelash when you see a man having earrings in both ears or whatever. It's not. We don't look at it, and then we look at like hair length. I had long hair in high school.
Yeah.
No one in my high school mistook me for anyone but a male.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that in decades past, people were mocked sometimes in some places for being a male and having long hair. Like, oh, that's are you a boy or a girl or something, right? And it's also incredibly arbitrary because we all have the hair on our heads.
Mm-hmm.
So why is this like? And then we get to clothes. Clothing is just choices. Most of the clothing in the past was about function rather than form. But why do we get this situation where most of the things that we would use to identify in polite society have to do with how we're choosing to present ourselves and what we choose to adorn ourselves with, etc. So, what are your thoughts on this? Where are we with this?
Yeah, I mean, to get really, I feel like, uh, gender being a social construct and people trying to preserve that social construct to me is about the preservation of power and the systems we have in place. That if you disrupt this system that men are men and women are women, and so men wear pants and women wear dresses, and women can wear nail polish, but men can't wear nail polish. If you disrupt this system, I feel like there's this worry or fear that it will disrupt other systems. If you go, think about even women only were really able to start to work in factories when they were necessary to the war, and then were told to leave after that. That's where the suffragette, not the suffragette movement, but this idea that like women can work comes from.
Yeah.
It's a disruption of
Social order.
Of social order, and where power lies, that men would be the one who would earn money, and bring it home, and have that type of control. And that's, fearful. If you have the ability to try and maintain that, I think I can understand, in the fear of the unknown and change, to try and preserve that. Yeah, I mean, it's the other piece too about this idea that preserving, gender as the social gender as what it is it also harms cis women. I remember talking with this writer, Frankie de la Creta's a great sports writer, and we were talking about fairness in sports, and how when you start, the ways in which you start to restrict trans people from participating in sports is also going to restrict cis people from participating in sport as well. So say, for example, you're a cis woman, but you have this high level of testosterone. Suddenly you're going to be restricted from competing in sport because you have this unfair advantage that is perceived as masculine. And my favorite response I think I've ever, which is Frankie said, it is true. If you start to restrict bathrooms by the way people look and present, well, a cis woman who has has short hair is might, and this is proven to be true. There is evidence that cis women have been harassed in bathrooms. So a cis woman goes into a bathroom and is kicked out, and it turns out, well, they're a cis woman. I think trans people have every right to be in the bathroom, but this person certainly has every right to be in that bathroom. It's going to hurt cis people, but also, don't trans people just have the right to human decency and respect as well? So my favorite response of like, yes, it is true, but we don't have to look at every lens through, well, what if it hurts cis people too? Like, if we only ever did things because it would protect cis people or straight people or white people or men, then that's a bad way to
society that's built for only part of us, not all of us.
That's right. So I think that gender is a social and we've moved to a place, but you look at this, if you're familiar with the trans exclusionary radical feminists, who their idea is that, why don't we let, rather than a boy who I guess a trans girl who's born as a boy, rather than thinking, well, they might be trans and they, put them on puberty blockers and then they might be trans, why don't we just let them, he should be able to wear a dress. He should, all of these things. But then you look at some of the people who exist in this movement, who then criticize, when there was a Twitter post that went a little viral of this person who's non-binary, and they were going to school in their workplace, not a school, sorry, in dresses, sometimes lipstick, sometimes in a suit, just like whatever they wanted to wear. And people were like, what a freak. And it's like, but isn't this the exact, if you as like you don't think transness exists, but you're okay with breaking down gender as a social construct, then shouldn't this be the exact way? He's not saying I'm a woman. He has a beard, but he wears lipstick. It's all, this sort of stuff. But it to me, when I then see these people who, because I looked into this when I first came, I was like, well, maybe I'm not trans. Maybe I just want to do drag sometimes, and obviously that's not me. But then when I look at the reaction to then how they see people who are moving through the world in the way that they proclaim, and then they're saying that they're freaks and unnatural, and it's like, I think you're just trying to preserve some notion of what was, for the reason of maintaining power and control and order and your understanding of the world.
Well, always in every situation from the beginning of time, the people who have some notion of something to lose will be the least likely to want to have anything change.
Right.
That's always been true. That's been
And
true of everyone.
yeah. And they use these examples of things that might or could happen or say are happening at an overwhelming rate,
Mm,
like trans people competing in sports. The Olympics has allowed trans women, specifically trans people, but trans women, to compete for many, many years. There's never
mm,
been a single trans person who's, you know, platformed and won a medal at the
yeah.
Olympics. So this fear of like, well, this is what could happen if we let this happen. It's not bearing out to be true, and it's only to then preserve again some of that, the status quo, the power, that they currently hold on to, that they want to
Yeah.
keep or feel that they're losing. Yeah.
Those all seem like slippery slope arguments to me, and they don't hold up together very well, in my opinion.
I agree that there can be there can be, we should do more we should do more research, we do more science to prove that. Yeah, maybe MMA fighting, because of the bone density you maintain, maybe it proves that an extreme unfair advantage. But what is sports other than unfair advantages? But alas, I can
Yeah.
understand that there needs to be a line drawn somewhere, and that so many of these sports bodies already have these things of you must, you must take a testosterone blocker, you must be on estrogen for so much time anyway, where and often I have to think it's very interesting. I also live with type 1 diabetes,
Mm,
and some of this technology that's coming out, the way that the studies have to be for some of this technology, for it to be approved, my blood sugars have to be in better range than someone who doesn't have diabetes. And so it's
mm.
this interesting, this thing of like, well, in some ways, if the technology becomes so far advanced, my blood sugars will be better than somebody without diabetes. And I think of the same thing. It's often all of these pieces, like my testosterone, if I was to go and try and compete in an internationally governed sports institute, my testosterone would have to be much lower than a cis woman, because that's what happens when you're on the
Right.
testosterone blocker versus how much testosterone
Yeah.
your body might automatically mix. So, yeah.
So, what is dead naming and why should we avoid it?
Yeah. So, dead naming is the act of using the name that someone potentially was used or given before, if they decided to change their name. So, I have a name that my parents gave me when I was born, and try not to. Most people don't use it, but I think the reason is, it's, the other thing that's funny about, like, well, that's not really your name, is like,
Mm.
well, yeah, but like T-Pain also isn't his name, like
Yeah.
he's not
It's
Snoop Dogg. He's not, the amount of
yeah.
actors that are like change their name to become,
Cher wasn't her name when yeah.
yeah. So,
Madonna also
yeah.
not yeah, right.
Yes. And so not that I'm Cher or Madonna or Snoop
Right.
Dogg,
Yeah.
but it is sort of acceptable in our society that you might go by something, even a nickname,
Yeah, well,
and so the thing about dead naming is, it often comes with, for trans people, it also often is to attach to a time where we were maybe at our lowest points and there's obviously like, I'll get to another thing I want to talk about in a bit, but yeah, it's often associated with this time, and it's almost like, when we choose our own name, that is us embracing this new
mhm.
identity, this decision we've made, because when you're trans, I often talk about the hardest time period of being trans is when you have all these thoughts when you're, likely when you're young or whatever, and you're like, I could be, and then I said like, no, maybe I'm not. And I looked up like,
Mm.
gender radicalism, and like, okay, maybe that's it. And I'm like, no, it's actually not it. And that moment where yourself, you're like, oh shit, yeah, like I am trans,
Yeah.
but like I'm gonna have to come out to people, and that's like so scary. And coming out might mean I lose my job, or I get kicked out of my apartment, or my friends don't talk to me, my family kicks me out of my house, all these things. I'm very
Yeah.
lucky that none of that ever happened to me. But there's that moment where you're not sure how the world will react. And then you
You
come out, and you either it goes well or it doesn't, but you've made this decision because it's the best decision for you
mhm.
in your life. And yeah, it's like it's a silly metaphor, but it's like when you become a butterfly. Like if you saw a butterfly go around, you kept being like, that's a caterpillar. Like,
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I guess you could say that, and maybe in
yeah.
some
But
way you're
they're
right, but
not a
like
caterpillar anymore though. That's
they're
the
not a
point.
caterpillar anymore.
Yeah.
Now they're a
Right.
butterfly. So to me, and using that name is often it's like, I hate the, now this is what I was going to get to. I hate the analogy that like that old person is dead, or they're not you. My mom would say this comment of like, and she maybe once or twice of like, oh, I lost a son. And it's like, yeah, but I'm
Oh.
still, there's so many parts of me that were in me before,
Yeah.
but now I'm a fuller version of my mom is great. My mom is amazing.
Hmm.
My mom is the best. I just always need to shout that out. My mom has been so supportive. But yeah, it's like, yeah, it's an attachment to the, if you're going to use that name, it's you're bringing up, that's certainly a piece of me that's not me. Some people, I picked a name that's very close to my old name. I thought for me that was easy. Some people want something totally different.
Mhm.
It's a big part of coming out. It's almost more important than your pronouns, right? Because it's like that's the thing most people are going to call me, and if people aren't using it, you know, it's a
Yeah.
bummer. It sucks. So it's just about being nice again. But
What,
yeah,
yeah, a name is very personal, right?
yeah,
It's much more so I think than pronouns would be. I went through a time in my teens where I wasn't that happy with my name just
yeah,
because it made me seem odd compared to
yeah,
everyone else. In that time, I just wanted to fit in, and my
yeah,
name made me stand out more than I wanted to, and it was just a
yeah,
phase, right? But now I wouldn't want to be known by any other name.
right.
I kind of accepted my name, and I think that's. I mean, I happen to accept the name that I had from the start.
Yeah.
The fact that that doesn't necessarily happen with everyone, they have a different name, and it's not even necessarily that they change genders or something, right? Some
Yeah.
people start going by their middle name because they
One of
prefer it to their first name, right? It
one of
it
my
happens.
yeah, one of my favorite things I play in this online game of Dungeons and Dragons. Shout out to twitch.tv/DM Philly. Dungeons
Yeah.
and Dragons in space, and it became a bit of a running gag. We'd meet these people. My character can speak to animals, and so I'd go like, I'd meet a deer or whatever, and I'd be like, "What's your name?" And they're like, "Well, I've never been given a name." I was like, "Well, you can have any name you want." And it became this running gag of every time we meet someone in space, and like, "Yeah, my name's whatever." And I'd be like, "Well, you can have it. You can have any name you want." And it's kind of become a bit of our calling card. It's like you can name yourself whatever you want, but also it's sort of my call to cis people too. Is like, if you
Yeah.
don't like your name, you can
Yeah.
actually change your name. You can have whatever name you want.
Yeah.
It's not
Why?
just trans
Why
people
not?
get to have the fun. We get to do it all the time, but you
Yeah.
can be whoever you want to be. No,
I think people get hung up on this idea that there has to be a reason for their name.
right,
And I'm
right.
like, names are just as arbitrary as everything else we use to identify.
It's almost like it's
They're
a
also
social
social
construct.
constructs. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it's very rare that you would know somebody's name. And if you find it out, like if someone tells you there, I would presume they'll also tell you, like, please don't use it. But if for whatever reason, like sometimes they'll be like, oh, the story doesn't make sense if I don't tell you my, because I tell a lot of stories. I
Hmm.
like, I talk a lot. So,
Yeah.
it's like this story doesn't really make sense unless I tell you. And one of the thing I'm very proud of this in terms of someone who doesn't really take life too seriously is growing up, my mom would always tell me she wanted to give me this specific middle name, which is my uncle's middle name,
Hmm.
because she thought that my full name was going to sound great as a lawyer. I'm never going
Hmm.
to be a lawyer, but thanks, mom. It was a very nice
Yeah. Well,
idea. But she couldn't because it was the middle name was my uncle's name. And she thought that her father would be so mad because like she wasn't naming any of her kids after
Hmm.
my grandma, which was Hugh. It's a great name, but it's a little, it
Yeah.
doesn't always flow well. So when I was legally changing my name, I'd always really liked the sound of the names put together. So I did decide
Hmm.
to change it, but I gave it the feminized version of that middle name, which was
Hmm.
Alexandra into Alexandra.
Yeah.
But the other reason I really liked is because now I became Grace Alexandra Leeder, which as a initial spells is a pun, which is gal. So
Yeah.
I just thought it was perfect. So I had to change my name to Alexandra. So yeah, that's my
Yeah.
middle name. Yeah.
So this question might be. I mean, it's the question that I know the least about of all the questions I
Uh-huh.
wanted to pose to you. What is body dysmorphia?
Uh-huh. Yeah, body dysmorphia is not being happy with the body you have, basically. And I know you have in the notes you sent me some of these questions is like, is
Yeah.
it different than wanting to have a thinner waist or bigger shoulders? And no, there's tons of stuff that cis people do all the time
Right.
that I would consider affects is trying to alleviate body dysmorphia. It's just like cis body dysmorphia.
Oh
So
yeah.
people who get lip filler or Botox or whatever they get, whatever they go to do to
Right.
try and fix the way that they don't like the way that their body works. And body dysmorphia is a huge part of why people have eating, like disordered eating.
Hmm.
That's body dysmorphia of not, and a lot of that again is based on study. And one of the parts for me that was really interesting about trying to discover who I was trying to parse all the things like what do I think I who do I think I am? Who do I think I am not am because of the way because gender is a social construct. So
Mm.
I remember one time, and I wasn't really thinking about, my friend said, when you transition, you'll still be able to like baseball, right? And I said, yeah, I know. I know, but like, it was like, so, and I
Yeah.
remember I tried like wearing makeup and the thing about makeup for me is like, I have three brothers.
Mm.
It was a very like masculine household, a lot of sports, a lot of whatever. So it's not like I even had like a sister who was doing makeup and whatever. And the thing about now is like there's so much, like there's YouTube videos and you can like whatever you need to. So I'm constantly Googling, like I don't know how to do something in my house. I'll just like, there's a
Mm.
YouTube video for it.
Yeah, sure
Um,
there is.
but the thing about makeup for me is like I'm not very good at it, and the way to get better at it is to keep doing it. But as you're
Mm.
doing it and you're not good at it, it's like not very fun to like go out into
Yeah.
the world with bad makeup. So I
Yeah.
was going to work and I would try something. I was like, I don't really like, it's not my favorite, or like wearing a dress to work. But those are the days where I would often get the most compliments of like, you look amazing, you look great. And
Yeah.
it's funny because this is kind of that idea of like, I think where some people who do fall into the turf movement, who I think could be like pulled back, is that it is a little silly to think like the only way you get recognized as a woman is like if you wear a dress or you wear, you have nail polish or you have an earring or whatever. But sometimes that's the way, like that's when it would click for people that I was trans for some reason. So I remember
That
talking
you
to
were
my
trying harder to be that, maybe,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
So which was very nice, but also I remember I also had this one person who was very funny. She'd always come down the aisle at our work, and
Mm.
she knew that I had transitioned, and she was trying so hard to be inclusive. And she'd go, "Hi, ladies," and I was like, "Oh, that's really good." But Simon sits here too, like he's part of our group as well. So she was trying so hard
Yeah.
for me, but I was like, "Oh, but also Simon, who identifies as male, is like part of our group as well. Maybe doesn't want to be called ladies." But she was so nice, right?
Yeah.
But I remember going to my therapist and I remember talking about this. And I was like, yeah. And then I feel like, what if I wear a dress to work, am I like contributing to like, patriarchy? And she's like, well, you know what? You could just figure out what you like and who you want to be before you have to solve all of
Yeah.
that in the world. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
fair
You don't have
enough.
to
Yeah.
represent all people when
Yeah.
you dress for work. Yeah. You could
Yeah.
just dress for yourself.
Yeah. So, it's body dysmorphia is all these, I did decide to go on hormone replacement therapy to sort of like
Mhm.
change my body and the way it would look. And I'm very happy I made that choice. That's not for everybody. Not everybody and this I think is a very confusing thing for some people, that you
Mm.
don't have to have body dysmorphia to be trans, because I think that's so ingrained with like, a
Yeah.
lot of the stuff we'd see, like one of my earliest memories of trans people is like Maury, where it's like, okay, did this person have a sex change or not? And it's like,
Right.
it's like, we're so hung up with like, well, it must be that thing. It must be this most private, personal thing that
Hmm.
must be the thing that leads people to be trans. And then I think it's confusing for people when it's not that. And I think we're trying to be like, forget all that stuff you watched on TV for years.
Yeah.
You have to know that gender is so like, your identity is so ingrained in your brain that
Hmm.
it is not a matter. And this has been scientifically proven as well. They've done brain scans that shown that trans people's brains um react differently, look different than cis people. So it's like, yeah, but yeah, body dysmorphia, it's not different. It's not different than wanting some piece of you, to want to work out
Right.
more,
Okay.
to have abs. It's not, it's really
Right.
not. It's only that for some people, the body dysmorphia is actually about like, there is like gender and sex components that
Mhm.
are, play
Yeah.
into it. Yeah.
I mean, as a 16-year-old, I did an obscene number of push-ups and
Uh-huh.
sit-ups
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
because I watched movies and I wanted to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Like I wanted to
That's
have a
tough.
body that was,
That's a tough
you know,
one to try and
yeah,
handle.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was, but I looked up to that. Well, I'm in, good shape. Maybe
Yeah.
I could be buff like that. I could be,
Yeah.
muscle man or whatever. But I could never get my shoulders to be anywhere near like that. It was just not happening for me. It was
Well,
like, something I
yeah.
had to live with.
Well, and I think the same thing is true for that there are scientific with hormone replacement therapy, with some of the surgeries we decide to get, but also there is this idea of passing in the trans community, and it's something that I
Mm.
think it's such a goal for people because it will make it easier for you to maneuver around in society. So passing
Right.
is essentially the idea that you are perceived as a cis woman if you're a trans woman, or you are perceived as a cis man if you're a trans man. And the reason of is obvious that you are less likely to face discrimination or harm for being
Right.
trans if you pass as a cis person. The thing that becomes hard is the more that becomes like the idealized version, the people who will never pass. So say, lots of, not to say that a trans woman who decides to transition at 55 won't be able to like pass, but also there are, there's a little piece of me that's always like, boy, if being trans was more acceptable and it happened when I was a kid, I wouldn't have gone through puberty. And some of the things that are like I could do voice training. I'm not super keen to do voice training, but
Mm.
there's all these things I wouldn't necessarily have to do that would make it easier for me to pass. And at the same end, I don't want passing to be, because I don't want people who don't have the means to pass, either financially or whatever is going on in their life that would mean they can't pass. Those people should not be treated,
Yeah.
less fairly than people who can pass. So it's very complicated. Passing is sort of a complicated thing because it's often a thing people strive for, is that's like the end goal, but it's very difficult to do that, and is also problematic in a way. If the more people are in the two boxes of male or like man or woman, then where does that leave like non-binary people? Where does that leave people who can't pass, right? Like if we're like,
Right.
oh, that's the ideal, is to be a man or a woman, like that's not great for people who
Yeah.
that's not the end goal too. So
Yeah. I think that the drive to, as you say, pass for one or the other is a symptom of what society does to people.
right.
Really, it's that we generate a social expectation that you're one or the other, and then people who are trans will then push themselves to fit in one of those boxes. And I think we should get, I think a better solution is to get to a point where we accept that we don't fit necessarily, that some of
Yeah.
us aren't just one or the other or whatever.
Or change the box. Let it make us
Yeah,
fit in
change
the
the
box.
box. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I was
Have a
thinking
couple unique size boxes or whatever. That's
yeah.
fine.
And
Yeah.
the other piece is like it's got, because on top of this idea of like being trans and then your identity, there's also like cis people have this too, right? And that's what we're saying about like having big shoulders or a thinner waist or your
Mhm.
lips look amazing or whatever,
Yeah.
there's these ways in which basically like there's sort of this even for a cis person, this like idealized for that. Again, this is why I love media and why I think media is interesting, is because it's a funhouse mirror distortion of like, who did
Yeah.
we put in movies, who became superstars, who is the
Yeah.
sexiest man of the year.
Right.
Somehow it was what's his name, McDreamy this year. How did that happen? Who knows? But that's what sometimes when people struggle with like their own body, cis people struggle with body dysmorphia, that it's often all in that same vein. So trans people are kind of, I don't want to say are it's extra hard, but there's this like another thing, and not every trans person deals with the same thing that cis people deal with too, right? So it's anyway, it's very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it's wrapped up in what we consider to be beauty standards. And we think,
Right.
I think a lot of people think about beauty standards as being sort of like instinctive, like we're always going to like people who look a certain way, and that if you sent those people back in time, they would also be just as liked as they are now. Well, that's not in any way true, and we know this. There's I mean, a great example that I've heard from someone else before is I mean, we look at paintings from the past, and what people looked like in the paintings. They didn't have television or cameras or anything like that, but some people point out, well, these people, they were painted as being larger, what we would consider kind of fat or maybe even obese in some situations. But is that true? There's a painting that's called The Judgment of Paris, and this is about the Greek myth, of course, of the thing that started the Trojan War, according to the Iliad, was the three goddesses who are considered the most beautiful goddesses among the 12 Olympians went to a mortal being, that is Paris, and they asked him to judge which of them was the most beautiful. And he was the most beautiful human. And he is, painted in the picture as a larger person. All of them are the larger people. One of the goddesses is promising him the love of the most beautiful woman. She's also portrayed as a larger woman. And from this, we can see with media as a mirror, a reflection of what happened in that time, where larger people were considered to be more aesthetically beautiful.
which
That
is
must
which
be
is
clear.
well, it's also then there's I believe that's because if you were more wealthy and
Well,
therefore
yeah,
you could, and then you could commission art to be made, you might have been bigger because you had more food, you had more
well,
you were right, and so
right,
it is also a reflection of power. It seem and from my
yeah,
understanding, I did not
right.
study art history, although I am a history major, but yeah, bigger bodies, it's because that's who held power and control, and that
No.
was mostly food, right? Food and all of that stuff. So yeah,
In Chinese and Japanese cultures, they developed a beauty standard of having extremely white skin because
right.
that meant you weren't working outdoors. You were more likely to be upscale, in charge, indoors more, getting less sun, and that was seen as a more beautiful thing. And even today, many of the people in the Chinese opera will be painting their faces entirely
Oh,
white. This is
oh,
and so what we consider to be beauty standards are arbitrary, just like everything else about what we consider to be. So Arnold Schwarzenegger going back in time wouldn't have been the number one
yeah,
star at any time.
yeah.
He,
Well,
he he would have been working in the fields, right?
the other thing I was thinking of, I'm watching some media that's very like women centric lately. There's a couple of series that have come out, and one is specifically about indigenous community, the new season of True Detective, and I've been
Mm,
thinking a bit about that too, about these societies where the importance of like women being leaders, or it being more of a matriarchal system.
yeah.
It's just that so many of our systems that have wherever they came from, which is basically from Europe and came over here, we that's what was dominant and established. And so the idea that the people who want to preserve that are also ignoring all these ways in which, like, people call it like the natural order of things, but also there are
Mm,
many places where the natural order of things was that it might be a matriarchal led society. And so like the idea that
yeah.
they're it's like the and indigenous communities, there's also, if you look at some of the acronyms for LGBTQ, also includes a two. It's often for two spirit. There are a number of tribes, and they're not even close to each other. They never encountered each other, who
Hmm.
all had this idea of basically a third gender, which is two spirit, and that you would inhabit both the masculine and the feminine. And they're
Yeah.
actually, in many of the tribes, revered in a way, in terms of having this. There's an Indian culture to this too, about this, like, form of trans people who are known to be quite, like, the idea is that they're quite spiritual. It's like were born a boy and then have this feminized or woman hood to you, there's something supernatural that you're able to tap into, sort of in the more binary view of the world, like the masculine and the feminine, and how revered that would be. Obviously
Mm.
that it did not happen in sort of like the Western
No.
European society, but there were societies and civilizations and tribes where that was the natural order. That was how things happen. So
Yeah.
you know, yeah, anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that, but just
Well, it led to that from our other
yeah,
point. So I have a little sort of a brief explainer
yeah,
that I've used in some informal situations to explain to people what I feel is happening. Well, not happening. I shouldn't say it that way, because there's some level of biology and genetics and something much more complicated happening. But this is sort of an explainer that just allows people to see it in their minds, I think, is a better way to put it. So I'd like to go through it, and maybe you can kind of let me know what you think of it,
yeah.
or
Hmm.
where it's off course, or where it could be better. So imagine that you have a piece of paper in front of you, and you put two dots on the piece of paper, one on the left side, one on the right side. And above the dot on the left side, I want you to label it male, and above the dot on the right side, label it female. So, in the traditional view of what's happening with humans here, there are just two dots, and this space between them on the page is just an empty gulf. You're just one or the other, and there's just two very small islands, and everyone fits in these two little dots. Right. So now I want you to just draw a straight line directly between the two dots. And this is the new view, that everyone is at the two dots, or on the line that's somewhere between the two dots. And this is where we are. So people who, first of all, people who try to take the idea that you can declare yourself other things or you can identify as other things, no one is really doing, as far as I could tell, no one is really doing anything other than identifying as being somewhere along this line. No one is somehow strangely at a third dot somewhere up or down the page. No one's identifying as a cat. No one is trying to identify as some intangible concept like judgment. And I think it's important to realize that to say, like, in some rhetoric that people have come up with, to say that men and women don't exist anymore, well, that's also not true, right? Because what defines the line is the 2 points at either end. No one's saying that anyone is, there's any males that are claiming that they're further left than the leftmost dot, or any females who are further right than the rightmost dot. It's bound on both sides by the 2 things that we know of to be, and that some people are somewhere in between. And to make it just a little more complicated, but still true to the situation, some people are moving from one point to another and finding, in moving in steps, maybe finding the spot that they feel comfortable. And some are moving and going all the way across. Some people are moving maybe partway across and then stopping and getting to a point where they feel comfortable. So what do you think of this explanation? Is it useful?
I think it is useful. I mean, I think the more you're like in it, the more you're like, oh, is that quite right? Is that, because
right.
I would question whether or not this, what are we labeling on this, which is probably gender identity, probably on this, but there's also gender expression, right, on that you can that is can be different. So like for a good example is like when I knew I was trans, my gender identity now shifted. I now know, oh, I'm a trans woman, but my gender identity continued to be that of a masculine cis presenting person, because was how I felt the safest to move through the world. Yeah. So I like it. I think as like to broadly explain it, I think it worked. There was my mom fell for it. Apologies if my mom's listening, but she fell for the litter boxes being added to schools. Have you heard of this? The rumor mill.
There was someone claimed there was a young child somewhere that was identified as a cat. That story has been told many times, but I looked into that. That wasn't really happening.
Yeah. I mean, I personally get a little conflicted about the thing, because I struggle with like people who identify as furries, and the idea, my understanding is that almost nobody is 100% of the time identifying as a furry, that you might have moments where and if you're not familiar with the furry, look up furry, furry.
I watched the episode of CSI that had the furries. That was very instructive.
I was speaking broadly to the audience,
right?
Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
But and I struggle with it because in some ways I don't want to dismiss what people get out of identifying as a furry. So I don't know. It becomes more common. And I don't feel like I'm an expert to judge. It's their own thing. The other piece I think I was thinking about as we're talking about it is the thing this best represents gender identity. I think this piece of paper line. The thing that I want to acknowledge, and I don't know how many people are listening to this who like are so firmly entrenched in sort of like trans people aren't real or don't exist or whatever, but the idea that like trans people are ignoring their sex is not true. Every time I go to my doctor, it's not like my doctor and I just pretend I wasn't born male.
Yeah.
It's like he knows, just so you know, he knows. He is fully aware, and he takes into account. So if there's things that like, if it affects my hormones, then that's one thing. But if it affects part of me that's like, masculine that I can't change, then we're talking about it. But from a broader society lens, like why does it matter? What, as long as, people are being respectful, not interfering on people's lives. And I think it's overblown how much the people will say that trans people are interfering on people's freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it is a good for both gender identity and gender expression. I think people should know also that like those two things don't have to perfectly align. And that might feel confusing, but the idea there is like, I think specifically if you think about, a good example is probably like a cis woman, who is like, a butch lesbian. Her gender identity it could just be that of like a woman. Her gender expression will have lots of elements that are more masculine, and so will fit more, to that right side of the spectrum, whereas or the left side, I guess I should say, on the gender expression line, whereas her gender identity might be really firmly planted on the right side of that graph. So I think it is good. It's just that's the only piece that I, as I'm thinking about it. But from a, if you're trying to explain to somebody who really doesn't, is not versed in, we all live in a lot of, especially if we're online a lot, we all live in our bubbles, where your social media feed gets curated, you follow the people you want to follow. And so if you know a bit about transgender people already, this maybe is basic, but if you're trying to explain to someone who doesn't know, I think this is a really good place to start.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember there's a comedian who talks about how her mom got offended that she felt like, because she's a cis woman but she looks very non-binary. Like, people keep saying you look non-binary, and she said to her mom, I don't think you need to know that yet. I think we're too early in your education. And her mom got really offended. She's like, why can't I learn about non-binary? But like, she's like, because I think it'll be too complicated. But anyway, yeah.
A couple things based on what you said there. I think that I can't remember the wording you used. It was something about there's some people who use language like that trans people are somehow infringing or trespassing on a thing. That language, to my mind, strongly reminiscent of language that was used to describe homosexuality back in the 90s.
It's the same playbook, Spencer. It's the same playbook.
100%.
Don't go into bathroom. They can't go to bed. They can't be around children. They can't. It's all the same playbook.
That they're somehow alien to our society. And that
marriage is
dangerous.
a protected traditional thing that they're not part of it. Like, that's obviously not happening with trans at the moment, but like, it's
that marriage is only playbook. For the purpose of bearing children, which is then it brings up all kinds of questions. Like, why would we let older people marry, for example? Right. Yeah.
I remember there's a really great, I believe it's another Ben Shapiro moment where he's explaining, and the guy and the student lets him go on and on about it, like, it's about child rearing and why, and then he goes, okay, so when your children go off to school and they're not at your home anymore, are you going to divorce your wife? It's really good. Yeah, it's great.
yeah. Shapiro has a lot of holes in his arguments that he just kind of talks over, but and then the other part that you mentioned, that there could be people who have a gender identity that isn't currently matching their gender expression.
Yes.
If we were able to modify society such that we accepted all of those identities, do you think there would be very many people who had this gap, or at least if there was this gap, it would be very, very, very small?
No, I think that's kind of the dream. One of my favorite quotes, I'm surprised I haven't said it yet, is that trans people do not want your cis kids to become trans people. We just want trans kids to become trans adults. And so the thing behind that is, the more that we can, the more that you can let somebody explore their gender expression, which is sort of the heinous thing about these bills that restrict gender affirming care, because they've kind of lumped this idea of gender affirming care. And whenever you say, well, I'm for gender affirming care
about it, right?
I know. And they'll say, well, so you're for children having surgery. And it's like, well, actually, if you look at what gender affirming care is for children, it's basically let them use a pronoun that matches what they would like, let them have a name, and let them that matches their gender their gender expression that they want, and then let them wear clothes that expresses their gender identity. That's it. Nothing harmful, nothing, But the problem is that the things that are potentially harmful about that is the way that society is designed, which is that other kids might make fun of them for doing that. That's what's harmful, right? So the more
bullying argument,
yeah. And again, not to this idea that Frank says trans people should deserve their own respect and human decency, but also the thing that is great about letting people explore their gender identity. There are many people who explore their gender identity who think they might be trans and discover they're not trans. And through playing around with gender discover, oh, that's not me, but I do want to keep this piece of like, I like having my nails painted, and they get
Yeah.
to keep that. And it's, for me, a safer, society, and it's when I do think that these bills that are being passed, the thing that is harmful, and you can just see it, that they want to just legislate trans people out of existence, and that's what's scary. And that sounds like I'm maybe being alarmist, but I think it's true. I think that if you look at the rates of suicide attempts for trans kids, it's extremely high.
Yeah.
And what the legislation was doing was basically saying, okay, let's protect kids. And now that they've done that in many places, now they're saying, okay, but also now you can't go on hormones if you're an adult. And so they like, it's like a really good, sports strategy of like, yeah, we'll go on defense here. And that, they've done it both. And what they've done is stop people from being able to be themselves and continue to increase that rate of suicide. So what I want in the world is that, yeah, for those for that gender expression and gender identity to align perfectly. And I think the sooner you can allow people to do that and try to figure out and try to, and have the freedom that it can always change. Like if people decide to detransition, I'm fully support. You should be whoever you want to be and who you are. And I don't have any ill will to people who detransition, because that's a choice that you thought you were making this right choice. And those choices come with lots of time with a doctor and a therapist and self thinking, So, I want those two lines to be brought up. And I think we have to change society to do that. And so like in this example, like, yeah, you can advocate. There are bills in Canada right now. The conservative government is, or not the conservative government, I'm sorry, the Conservative Party of Canada, in their platform policies, are advocating for some of these changes with the idea that if they were to get into power, they would implement some of them. So you can obviously do your part by voting, by calling your MP if there's any movement that's happening on these, but also just in your daily life, trying to, the smallest things you can do, like I said, when somebody's misgendering me using the wrong pronoun at a table, to say, oh, just so you, and you don't have to do it in a mean way. You don't have to scold them. And I actually don't, I think there are people who deserve to be scolded. Let's not mistake that I think there are as many of them that I've mentioned on this podcast who I think are actively behaving dangerously and are harming trans people. But your coworker who just is out for dinner with you and accidentally misgendered you, they don't need to be scolded. They could, hey, just so you know, what's that? And they'll decide to change or not. So, yeah.
Yeah. Becoming the word police just makes a person insufferable, which is probably why you don't do it. Right?
I don't do it. It's
because you have social graces. You don't want to have to
full of social graces. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. It's part of what charisma we call that. You have some level of charm. Everyone has a little bit of it, although to some we have to dig deep. But yeah.
It's really tough. The people who are angry at the world and are angry and get mad and are demand. I get that. I feel that. I think it's really hard to when I just don't think that directed at the wrong people. I don't think that always works. I don't really think the cancel culture exists. And I also yet know that there are people in sort of the podcast community who one thing you say on a podcast that then you get people yelling at you on Twitter, I don't think is the most conducive way to, and I'm saying that from like a very privileged point that like I get to speak my voice out a lot. And I don't want to say that like, I'm not open to change, but I know for myself, I get like, I put my, when it's like, when you come at me in a certain way, depending on what the thing is, if it's important enough, I think if I'm so wrong, then that's one thing. If I'm like kind of wrong, I feel like, do you have to use all I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. It's complicated. Yeah. Yell at politicians too. But I don't know.
Yeah. We don't yell at politicians enough, I think, in general. Yeah. So I feel strongly that you don't have to be a member of a particular group to make allowance for their existence. If we're going to be a society that accepts people who aren't like us, then we need to walk the walk. Do the work to understand what that means, to accept them. Some of the more outlandish rhetoric surrounding transgenderism involves a notion that our language is being policed, that it represents some level of oppression, that some imagined authority is watching us and is ready to slap us on the wrist for stepping outside the bounds in some way. The people who push this notion want to rally a mob to push back against the imagined authority. But that authority is imagined. The only oppression in this situation is what the majority of us will do to a vanishingly small minority in order to make us feel less uncomfortable with a changing world. Giving into the rhetoric of hate is a recipe for oppression of people who don't fit into the ordinary boxes. Having conversations about the fact that transgender people exist will help to normalize their existence in the minds of people who don't encounter them. Trans people have to live their lives. The least we could do is include them in our conversations. If anyone has any comments or questions or concerns or wants to tell me how we got the whole thing wrong, you can send that email to truthunrestricted@gmail.com. And with that, I'll sign off. So until next time.